Professor Tong, Jim, our dear friends from the United States, ladies and gentlemen. It's really my honor to introduce Professor James Fearon to you. Professor James Fearon is a leading political scientist known for his work on international relations and political violence. He holds the Theodore and Francis Gabel Professorship in the School of Humanities and Sciences at the Stanford University, and he's also a senior fellow at Stanford's Freeman Sparkley Institute for International Studies. Professor Fearon got his PhD from Political Science Department at UC Berkeley, and I would like to mention a little bit that I had a very interesting 6-year overlap with Jim at UC Berkeley. We went to the same school, and we enjoyed a wonderful academic environment as well as the natural environment, especially the unpredictable weather at UC Berkeley. So good old Berkeley, get it together for a happy reunion. Professor Fearon's research explores civil and interstate wars, ethnic conflict, and democratic accountability. He has written many very influential, impactful articles, and I remember vividly, and this has something to do with Professor Fearon's colleague at Stanford, David Lighton. I think David was the vice president of the American Political Science Association when I went to attend an annual meeting of APSA and invited him to come to Taiwan to give a series of academic talks. And that was a time when Professor Fearon and Professor Lighton, they wrote a series of very influential articles on ethnicity, civil war, and so on and so forth. So much so that the American Political Science Association annual meeting had a special session on, and I don't, probably I get the sequence wrong, but it's like when Fearon meets Lighton, or when Lighton meets Fearon. And that special session, I think, is talking about how academic expertise in qualitative and quantitative approaches can get together and create wonderful research results. So that was it. But then I can only admire James' work from afar. And today it's really my privilege to be able to monitor his talk, and he's going to share with us his insight on the conventional balance of terror, what's needed for deterrent stability in the Western Pacific. Really a relevant topic for all of us. So let's give a big applause to welcome Professor Fearon.
And really excited about being able to present this to you guys today. Thank you for coming. This is, for me, unusual, or it's not a very academic, different from the kind of work that Dr. Wu was referencing. It is related to a foreign affairs paper. I'm presenting basically this foreign affairs piece that just came out a few weeks ago, co-written with Andrew Lim. Andrew Lim is a civil servant who works in the Defense Department in the US. I know him because I had a wonderful public service leave a couple of years ago at 21 and 22, working there in the Biden administration. And I got to know him at that time. Really, he's very much the first author on this piece. The idea, as I was talking about a conventional triad, that's his phrasing and idea. But it kind of developed, the version that came out developed through our conversations over then and since then. I want to stress, although, I mean, just to be absolutely clear, this does not, nothing I say, I'm not speaking on behalf of Andrew. As is stressed at the beginning of the foreign affairs piece, he's not writing in any official capacity. It's his private views. He's not representing views of the U.S. government, of course, nor am I. I'm representing my views as, me and I guess faculty at Stanford. So I'll present the article. And then at the end, I'll do a little more IR theory-ish academic stuff to close out. Okay, so to summarize, so like I said, it's a very policy-focused piece and very much focused on U.S. defense policy. Although it's going to have, as you'll see, connections and implications for decisions and policy decisions in Taiwan and other allies and partners in the region. So, basic idea is that the People's Republic's missile capabilities have grown so much over the last 25 years in all dimensions, short, medium, and long-range missile capabilities, that the way that interacts with U.S. force posture and U.S. defense policy strategy in the region has had, to a degree undiscussed largely, created very strong first strike incentives for both sides in the event of an intense crisis or the beginnings of a war. For U.S. and allies and partners in the region, this is bad for deterrence. For everybody, PRC and U.S. and allies and partners, it's bad for crisis stability and risk of inadvertent, possibly really massive escalation, including nuclear escalation. What we argue in the paper is that this situation parallels rather closely the situation that the US and the Soviet Union faced in the 50s concerning incentives for nuclear first strikes. And that we're arguing for a solution similar to a conventional triad, parallel to what was the solution to the problem as it was faced in the 50s, developing a nuclear triad, the point of which is to assure a secure second strike, the ability to strike back in a quite devastating manner, even after having suffered a first strike by the other side. A nuclear triad, as I'm sure many of you know, refers to three legs, three domains, land, air, sea, consisting of ballistic missile submarines, bombers, and ICBMs delivered from silos on land. Okay. As I said, we argue in this piece for a parallel solution at the conventional level, a conventional triad to reduce the vulnerability of US forces to a conventional first strike by the PRC. What would that look like, or what's key there? US needs to, for itself and in certain complementary ways, working with allies and partners, develop missile platforms that are more numerous, critically more elusive and hard to target, and then they have to work, meaning they have to be enabled by resilient and functional command and control infrastructure and architecture. So what does that mean specifically? It means more road mobile platforms. These are often called TELs, transport erector launchers. They're a truck that drives around and has the capability to fire missiles from it. Increased production of B-21 bombers in the US case, and even more quickly, something you can do faster than build more B-21s is something called palletized munitions, where you adapt a cargo aircraft to open up the back and it becomes a platform for launching cruise missiles. A good number of them. More submarines. This takes time. It's really, really important, though. Increased production of Virginia-class subs, and then although you might be surprised, there's Starlink or the SpaceX and other companies are putting up lots and lots of commercial satellites. It's still the case that the actual number of military use satellites is a fairly small network. Everyone recognizes it needs to grow and become more resilient to potential various kinds of attacks. At the end, I'll going to somewhat higher, and let's say we'll call it more IR theory level, I'll be asking, is in the longer run or in the medium and long run, is there a kind of stable balance of power feasible for the Western Pacific in light of the staggering changes brought about by the economic and military development of the PRC? Stable in what sense? Stable in the sense that countries in the region with large economies can, maybe with support from the US, maintain their economic independence and political autonomy despite the potential for PRC coercion? I'm going to suggest yes, it definitely can be, but it's going to have to be in a form of a mutual deterrence regime at the conventional level. So there's no way, simply no way to defend forces from PRC missiles and PRC ability to hold at risk, particularly anything floating on the water in the area. But states in the regions can collectively, and to some extent separately, develop missile capabilities of their own to hold PRC naval forces at risk as well. And that suggests the possibility of something like a conventional deterrence equilibrium backed by implicit threats of what would essentially be naval wars of attrition. Okay. So I'll talk, here's a roadmap. I'll talk about the PRC's counter-intervention strategy. You know, where do these incentives to first strike come from? The parallel to the nuclear case, what a conventional triad would look like. Talk briefly about, are there alternatives to, you know, other approaches that could be taken? Talk a little bit about a bigger picture view of the evolution of military technology and its implications for these kind of strategic political strategy questions or strategy questions, and then talk about this idea of a long-run deterrence equilibrium. So, okay, counter-intervention strategy. So, central goal of PRC military modernization has been to reduce the ability of U.S. forces to intervene in the event of an attempt to use force to change the status quo in Taiwan. PRC calls this counter-intervention. The U.S. has talked about it as anti-access area denial, A2AD, which I'll often use because just it's shorter than writing out counter-intervention. So the core of the strategy, counter-intervention strategy, has been a huge increase in missile and reconnaissance and targeting capabilities to sink U.S. and/or ally and partner shipping. Ships, military and otherwise. You see this a little bit in this chart, which is taken from these, US government's been putting out these things known as the China Military Power Report since 2002 or 2001 really, that gives estimates of numbers. And you see really remarkable, I mean, you've seen, as has been much reported on, the black is the number of nuclear ICBMs that they've been building out in the hinterlands. Some increase there in recent, it's caused a lot of discussion. In some ways, at least in the public and in the IR field, less discussion of this much larger increase in conventionally armed medium and intermediate range missiles. This doesn't include, we can't really count it very well, the number of cruise missiles, which are held by different services in different parts of their military, and there are a lot of them, or short-range ballistic missiles, of which there are, the numbers are harder to estimate, but probably around 1,000. What's the effect of this? Well, what we argue is that, I mean, we're not the only ones. Everyone has, people have been arguing this for quite a while. This expanding A2AD capabilities undermine the U.S.'s traditional means of power projection and deterrence in Asia, in maritime Asia in particular. What was that traditional approach? It was based on highly visible, slow-moving surface ships, carrier strike groups in particular, bases with allies and partners and some in U.S. territories that are fixed, visible, and highly dependent on unprotected commercial support, and increasingly satellite networks that, as I just mentioned, as of now still depend on a relatively small number of satellites. Satellites at the distances relevant for command and control here are easily findable. It's a very exposed environment in low Earth orbit and medium Earth orbit. So a whole bunch of different kinds of analysis have been showing, and just basic logic, that U.S. naval vessels are very vulnerable and in war games and such take very large losses, often within the first couple hours even, or day, of a conflict. It just stands to reason that slow-moving, highly visible surface ships are just very vulnerable, especially when they get inside the first island chain. Okay, what are the implications of that? Well, here's where we're playing out something that's a little bit less discussed. Because U.S. forces are highly vulnerable to PRC missiles, the U.S. has incentives to move quickly to attack missiles and platforms and systems that enable them in China. the current Indo-PACOM commander of the U.S., Admiral Paparo, said last year that his highest priority, in testifying to Congress, that his highest priority was to prevent the PRC from using its conventional missile arsenal against U.S. forces, in particular meaning naval forces, but also air bases around the region. He said, and in light of that, he said what we need to be able to do is, quote, blind PRC forces, that is, disable their missile capabilities before they can inflict significant damage. And that would include both attacking missile launch platforms, but also the command, control, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance systems that enable them. That's maybe more the blinding part. Now, this is, in saying this, he's reflecting a line of thinking that actually goes a fair way back in U.S. thinking about U.S. military thinking about the problem posed by China's increasing A2AD capabilities, which they're already noticing in the late 2000s. Their initial reaction was something that came to be called for a while air-sea battle, which was very much focused on, like, okay, given the threat to our carrier strike groups, what we have to do is attack their missile batteries. In other words, to do force protection by immediately going after the things that threaten them so we can continue sailing around within the first island chain. But big problems for that. I mean, it was problematic even in 2012 when it became kind of announced as doctrine. I mean, and it's evolved since then, but it's now, the problems are much, much clearer. In particular, the PRC's missile capabilities and systems are very dug in. They're very extensive, they're highly redundant, they're well dispersed. They are literally dug in. The PRC has invested enormous amounts in digging underground facilities that are very, very hard to effectively target. So this, number one, means that to have an impact, the kind of air-sea battle approach would have to be really big, and that would be highly escalatory because it'd be attacking sites in mainland China that are, many of them near urban areas and so on, many of them interpenetrated with nuclear command and control systems. So thus creating you know, if you were the US president, you'd be worrying about like triggering massive escalation. All right. Because US forces are vulnerable, and because the PRC's goal is to stop US intervention, and because PRC knows, the PLA knows about the incentives that the US has for attacking their counter-intervention capabilities, the PRC also has a strong incentive to strike first. In other words, to blind the US, in particular by attacking, well, not only attacking the assets themselves, but also the systems that enable them, the networks, to blind the US before the US can, quote, blind them. So what we have is a situation that is quite similar in many ways to what Schelling in a very famous article called a reciprocal fear of surprise attack, which was a way that he and others at the time worried would be a way you could get to nuclear war despite the fact that, despite mutual assured destruction, meaning that, you know, launching the weapons would be, in a certain extent, suicidal because you'd be retaliated against. How does it do that? Well, we have this situation where in an intense crisis or the beginnings of war, the chances of misinterpreted signals or actions which actually do threaten retaliatory capabilities in the nuclear realm, I mean, the catastrophic escalation, of course, would be most catastrophic if it was nuclear, but it can also be conventional, is that, you know, we argue for, there's a similar kind of problem here. At the same time, you know, from a more US and ally and partners perspective, this is also a situation that weakens deterrence because of the vulnerability and the potential that, you know, in some push comes to shove or political crisis situation, Xi Jinping might feel like it was worth rolling the dice on preventing intervention by, you know, taking Taiwan, moving quickly to disable and demobilize US ability to intervene. I should say, if anyone wants to stop with a question, I'm happy to, or raise your hand, please do. I'm happy to engage on, you know, during the talk, not just talk at you the whole time. So yeah, so the U.S. faced a similar problem in the 50s, and the title of our piece is I mean, Foreign Affairs chose it, but it's riffing on this Wohlstetter famous article called The Delicate Balance of Terror, in which he argued that U.S. nuclear force posture at the time, which was heavily based on on bombers, delivering nuclear weapons by bomber squadrons that were pretty concentrated in a relatively small number of bases. He, probably in an exaggerated way, but nonetheless, he worried that this gave incentives, it was tempting for an attempt at a disarming first strike by the Soviet Union. And he and others at the time are saying, well, what we really need to do to get out of this dangerous situation is develop secure second strike forces. U.S. nuclear force posture needs to change so that it can survive or has enough capability to survive a first strike to be able to deliver assured destruction in a second strike. So Wohlstetter, Schelling, other strategists in the 50s pushed for a nuclear triad to assure second strike. That means nuclear weapons delivered by submarines, bombers, and on land ICBMs. Okay, how does that work? What's the basic principle of the triad? Basically, make your missiles hard to target. So how do you do that? Well, the best example and the most effective here are submarines, which are elusive. They're very hard to find and target reliably, and to destroy all of them at once on short notice essentially seems impossible. Likewise, or in a somewhat similar way, bombers can be loaded and dispersed quickly. Once they're in the air, they're extremely difficult to target. They can actually also be made difficult to target on the ground as well. Now, this does not apply to ICBMs. You know where the silos are, you have satellite pictures, they're easy to target. They deter, to the extent that they do, by a different kind of principle, which is that an adversary has to spend missiles attacking them to limit damage to themselves that they might want to use elsewhere for more counterforce effective means. This is sometimes referred to as a sponge logic, that they soak up some of the adversary's arsenal. However, if you put missiles on TELs, they become, especially in cluttered ground areas, extremely difficult to target, even with fancy AI systems, it seems. The US didn't do this. They had debated, but ended up not doing it in the US, but did have TELs in Europe. So that's the triad. Conventional triad. So our argument is that the PRC parity, or in some ways superiority in precision strike capabilities in the Western Pacific, it means that the US needs to reconstruct its conventional forces and strategic approach in the Indo-Pacific. Needs secure, assured conventional second strike that would both increase deterrence and increase crisis stability, lowering the risk of catastrophic escalation. How do you do this? Pretty well, in some ways straightforward. Need a lot more missiles, deep munition stocks of missiles, and placed on submarines, bombers, and TELs. And at the same time, that only works if they are enabled by resilient command and control systems. So the article talks more specifically about kind of the specific things that need to be done with US weapon systems, more Virginia-class subs, which the US Defense Industrial Base is trying to do with limited success so far, but hopefully it'll get more successful. B-21 bomber productions, these things take time and are slow. Palletized munitions can be done more quickly, and this can be done more quickly. So TELs, land-based missile systems, are already being deployed in certain Marine and Army formations in ally and partner countries. Mentioned, more resilient constellations of satellites. Ideally, these would be connected to, that means uncrewed aerial vehicle, so essentially sensor drone systems for targeting. That would also really help. And then kind of developing and integrating these sensor systems with allies and partners in the region as well. Okay, are there alternatives? Well, there was this air-sea battle approach, essentially preemptive strikes on, or early stage strikes in a conflict on PRC missile capabilities. As I already argued, extremely dangerous, increasingly not likely to work given the robustness, resilience of PRC missile capabilities. What about missile defense? The Trump administration is talking about Golden Dome, and Hegseth and others are talking about investing a lot of money in missile defense. I think there are probably some applications, some limited uses for this in terms of the problem set in the Western Pacific, but basically, the thrust of our argument, I think, is that it's a bad idea or an inefficient way to pursue, get after the problem that we're talking about here. The physics problem, kind of is terrible. It's like hitting a bullet with a bullet, very, very hard problem. The cost ratio is terrible. A dramatic illustration of this is like, you look at the estimates of the cost ratio that the US has dealt with for dealing with Houthi. So it's not only the PRC one of the things going on globally is a proliferation of precision strike capabilities. And Houthis are a really interesting example of proliferation to a technically non-state actor that has this unbelievably favorable cost ratio in terms of what it costs them to fire a missile versus the defense, what it costs to defend against it is extremely unfavorable. And then further, even if you did invest a lot, China has the resources easily to overwhelm, it's easy to design around missile defense just by overwhelming them, by decoys, by all kinds of deceptive means. All right, so a third possibility is something known as the third offset capabilities, which I'll talk about. I'll explain what that means in a minute. But these are like emerging tech capabilities like drones, uncrewed aerial vehicles, uncrewed undersea vehicles, cyber, artificial intelligence enabled things. So we don't discount those efforts and think that there are certain ways they can be important, in particular kind of complementary, but we don't think they're substitutes. They're not likely sufficient by themselves. So let me explain more about that with a little background. So what is this offset language? It's something that people who are really into defense policy know all about. I didn't really know about it as an IR person until I started reading in this area. The idea is this. So the idea they talk about the first offset was the idea that in the 40s and 50s the U.S. had this very big advantage in nuclear weapons, tried to use that as a principal means of deterring Soviet action in Western Europe in the 50s, and that in that sense the nuclear weapons at that time offset a very large conventional force advantage that the Soviets had in Europe. But, of course, the Soviets build up and they achieve rough nuclear parity by the late 60s, making the kind of the credibility problem, it was already there, making it worse. Would the US be willing to use its nuclear missiles in the event of a contingency, given that it would be on behalf of these allies, but the US might be targeted? Okay, so that leads in the 70s and 80s to an idea of a second offset to offset Soviet numerical advantages, again, conventional advantages. The US next develops technologies like stealth and precision strike. Okay. The idea being to use these new technologies to maximize the effect of each weapon, pinpoint key targets such as command and control centers, bridges, logistical choke points. The US demonstrates these kind of, at the time, amazing new precision-guided munition capabilities first in the Gulf War, then in Kosovo, then in Afghanistan, then in Iraq 2003. And right from the start, in particular in the 1991 Gulf War, the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese leadership took very strong notice and were really, really struck by this and said, we have got to get on this. And that in some ways kicks off the PRC's development of a precision strike regime. So over time, precision strike gradually proliferates, and not only the PRC, although they've really been the leaders outside of the US, but also Russia, Iran, and as I mentioned, even Houthi now. Okay. So the ultimate effect being that the second offset just no longer offsets. Okay, which brings us to the third offset. So some defense policy types, planners, intellectuals, blah, 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 in the, as they see this problem increasing with Chinese capabilities, by the time you get to the late 2000s, you have people arguing, we need a third offset, and I think Secretary Hagel announces pursuit of this, in speeches in 2014, where the idea is the third offset is the U.S. is going to harness disruptive tech, all right, in advantages in artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, sensor fusion. That means using computers essentially to sensor fusion is when you have a lot of different sensors and you need to like integrate and analyze all the data they're bringing in very quickly and accurately. Okay, so, and this is pursued, and I'd say with the Biden administration, you start to see some significant applications of third offset technology, in particular in what the Biden administration called the replicator initiative, that was intended to develop and field these kind of third offset technologies in the Western Pacific, and is like doing so. That came along with something announced publicly as this hellscape, dramatic name, concept of operations for using the equipment produced in the replicator initiative. Admiral Paparo has some interesting interviews about replicator and hellscape, where he says, this is great. What it does is it buys us time to get our actual forces. The Pacific, as you all know, is absolutely enormous. It's a long way from San Diego to Taiwan. So one of the big challenges has always been flowing forces. How long will it take to get there, and how exposed they are, logistically exposed they are in the process. So Paparo is saying hellscape buys him time to get forces into the fight, he says, to get there. We're suggesting in this piece that third offset technology is unlikely to be enough on its own. It can be complementary, but it's not a substitute. One thing, and I'm saying this in part because if we had certain people in the defense sector in the room, they'd be saying like, oh, you don't need all these missiles. We just have all this like great technology that can do it. Don't worry. And we should really go that way. We're suggesting no, probably not. Why not? Well, the problem is the physics of energy requirements. To get drones to Taiwan is a really long way, right? Even from other parts other than Taiwan in the region, as it sometimes put drones need a ride to the fight, all right? And the Pacific is just really gigantic. Now, that's less of an issue in principle for allies and partners in the region. And there probably are, there are high-value applications of third offset technology for Taiwan, Japan, Philippines, Australia, and integrating or coordinating with the U.S. on that would be great. But for U.S. forces, for the foreseeable future, really no strategic approach, or at least we argue no strategic approach is likely to succeed unless it provides U.S. missile capabilities and assured ability to survive a large-scale conventional attack. All right. Has great value as a complement more than a substitute. So, summing up, a conventional triad would present the PRC with a choice between a limited first strike, which would fail to seriously degrade U.S. forces, or a large-scale first strike, which would carry a significant risk of escalation and might still fail to find U.S. subs, bombers, and TELs. And then regardless of whichever one they chose, a greater proportion of U.S. conventional forces would be left to respond, which is important in the event of a protracted conflict, where against a potential adversary that has tremendous, much greater defense industrial base capabilities to regenerate. Okay, will the US do this? I don't know. In some ways, we talk at the end of the article about signs that are encouraging in terms of congressional and defense budget planning, which is consistent with what we're saying, or indicates some support for increasing sub-building, increasing B-21 production. some already getting into deployments of more road mobile capabilities in the Philippines, for example. And insofar as one can tell, I mean, if I don't know, you know, Hegseth, Secretary of Defense Hegseth gave a speech in Singapore on Saturday. A little hard to parse exactly, but seems to essentially be maintaining course at least in this area. Although with a lot more emphasis on missile defense, Golden Dome stuff, which, as I mentioned, I think would not contribute very much here to reduce vulnerability. So ally and partner efforts in these areas, particularly regarding road mobile capabilities, developing their, you know, Taiwan's own, Japan's own, et cetera, anti-ship missile capabilities from land, are highly complementary to US capabilities. What do I mean by complementary? This whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So the more Taiwan has these capabilities, the more effective US capabilities are, and vice versa. And they also, interestingly, like, you know, the more allies and partners in the region have an ability to hold out, to engage on their own, the higher the odds, I think, both politically and militarily, that you see the US getting involved. Okay, now some final thoughts on more, I don't know, vague IR theory thoughts. All right, deterrence and defense in maritime Asia. So we appear to be entering, or have already entered, a new era of major power conflict and war risk. The obvious examples being Russia's war against Ukraine, these growing tensions in Asia, particularly between the US, Taiwan, and the PRC. And, you know, Trump so far just talk, but nonetheless really, really staggering for those of us who've been watching international politics for a while in US foreign policy, that he's talking in ways about territorial aggrandizement in kind of late 19th century fashion. So a question I want to briefly treat here: does the economic and military rise of China fate Asia to regional hegemony? You hear this term a lot. Hegemony, regional hegemony. It's something that John Mearsheimer, and well, not only him, we'll talk about that China wants regional hegemony. It's kind of the natural, you know, great powers naturally seek regional hegemony and try to drive others out of their region. What exactly does that mean, regional hegemony? All right, I don't think it's a particularly meaningful concept in a world of nuclear weapons and long-range precision strike complexes. Why? Well, I think, you know, approximately 100 years of military technical evolution has made it increasingly difficult to convert economic might, the total GDP, say, of a country, into large-scale territorial acquisition. Or, for that matter, naval dominance near another country's coastline. Now, nuclear weapons are the extreme example here. The example I like to use is North Korea, a country that in the pre-nuclear age is a tiny little country that would be utterly helpless against either China or the US in a conventional war, could not survive without a very strong major power ally. In the nuclear era, North Korea is essentially immune to invasion and attack. It doesn't matter that the US has many, many more nuclear missiles than North Korea. They have a credible threat to use them in the event of attack. Whereas in the old days, the balance of power meant something in the sense that, you know, the relative power based on your total size of population, economy, the number of tanks you had, we're now in a world where extremely difficult, maybe not impossible, but extremely difficult to take a lot of territory from a nuclear armed adversary if they have their forces postured securely. So that's the extreme example, but precision strike regimes have a similar kind of effect in that, you know, Houthis can target and destroy US forces without having to, like, defeat the US military. Precision strike allows you to kind of go over classical defenses, targeting counterforce, but also countervalue, populations, cities, etc. even if North Korea didn't have nuclear weapons, their Seoul is so close to the border that conventional missiles might be adequate as a deterrent in the case of North Korea, against South Korea anyway. So, even small states can threaten and impose significant damage on another side's population or forces, especially naval forces, which are, exposed and visible if they're coming at you. Visible to the targeting problem is much less difficult the targeting problem for the US in Western Pacific is made quite difficult by the fact that we have to use satellites, which are very vulnerable. If you're Taiwan or Japan or so on, you can have radar looking out 400 miles or 400 kilometers and you can hide the radars, you can do all kinds of things which make solve a whole bunch of problems that are much more difficult if you're trying to use satellites. So we're entering a world where there's no way for the United States or states in the region to prevent the PRC from dominating the waterways of the Western Pacific in the sense of being able to threaten, or if they wish, destroy shipping and naval forces. So defense in the classical sense of force protection and territory protection, or protecting naval assets at sea, is not really possible in this world of proliferated long-range strike, precision strike. But the countries of the region can, in principle, develop your own A2AD environments to hold PRC naval forces at significant risk. So I think in the long run, at any rate, mutual deterrence is feasible, at least for issues of sufficient importance, like national economic survival. And one of the things that makes North Korea secure is that the survival of the Kim regime is credibly believed to be of sufficient importance that he would use nuclear weapons if attacked. So there's some credibility there. So I think in principle, the US does not even have to be in the picture in the longer run. Although without it, and this is one of the big questions, are we headed in a direction to see the real breakdown or further disintegration of the non-proliferation regime and South Korea and Japan, for example, seeking nuclear weapons? Without the US in the picture, if that were to come to pass, I think that would become a lot more likely. I mean, it might happen anyway. Now, of course, the ability of countries in the region to implement effective A2AD environments on their own varies, and varies to some extent with the size of the country, which raises a question of role and are there increasing incentives for alliance cooperation among the states of the Pacific Rim? Interesting article by Eli Ratner in the latest Foreign Affairs, or it just came out in Foreign Affairs about this, although with arguing for a US being part of that as well. You guys may know the phrase, that the US grand strategy post-World War II is basically NATO and the alliances in the Pacific. In NATO, we had a collective security agreement with everyone allied to everyone else, whereas in the Pacific, it's sometimes referred to as hub and spokes, where you have these bilaterals between the US and Japan, US and South Korea, US and the Philippines. Is it time to start thinking about moving beyond hub and spokes? And with that, some increased military coordination to try to develop something like a mutual deterrence regime in the Western Pacific. So that's what I have to say. Look forward to conversation.
Definitely, this is a wonderful talk. And I particularly like the way in which Jim brings back the insights from the previous Cold War to shed light on our current situation. Now, what I'd like to abuse my role as the moderator to ask the first question is, for a country like Taiwan, we have particular concern because in your presentation, basically you have taken United States and its allies as like a single strategic action. But then Taiwan has a very ambiguous position. It's not a treaty ally of the United States. It's not even recognized as a state by the United States. But oftentimes we are hearing that Taiwan is considered to be part of that American alliance system. And Taiwan is probably the flashpoint that will lead to the confrontation between the United States and the PRC. And so for people in Taiwan, they would like to know, even if United States can restore or have a robust balance of power in the nuclear and traditional sense, as you mentioned, these traditional Triad and so on and so forth. And so the situation between the two big countries has been stabilized. But then we have already seen that during the previous Cold War, there are proxy wars, right? Fought in Vietnam, in Korea, and then in Afghanistan. So the overall balance of power and stability between the two major antagonists does not guarantee that small and medium countries will not fall into a proxy war situation, particularly if that country is not even covered by any defense treaty. It's not under the extended deterrence of any of the two big powers. So how can you beef up a little bit Taiwan's confidence when you are talking about this kind of issue?
I'm sure you and people in this room are familiar with the reasons why, that there's an ongoing argument in U.S. foreign policy circles about whether the U.S. should move in the direction of formalizing some kind, or being more explicit or clear about its defense commitment to Taiwan, to include possibly a formal alliance. And I'm sure you're also aware that there's a great concern that there's what in the IR literature we sometimes call this like moral hazard problem of alliances, where certainly Beijing fears a great deal that if the US did that, it would encourage the DPP or parts of the PPP to press harder on formal independence, which we have all been led to believe would be a casus belli for a cause of war for the PRC, which, so far as I understand, the US absolutely does not want to have happen. The point is deterring or preventing that. So, I mean, I don't know what the Trump administration and the U.S. Congress will do there. And to your broader point, what can be done to reassure Taiwan? I think to some degree, it's just going to be a fact that no one knows what a U.S. president would do about intervention in the event of a crisis that, or action by the PRC to use force or begin to use force to try to change the status quo. No one knows. That's true not only under Trump, that would be true under Biden, despite several things that Biden said. There's too much depends on all kinds of unforeseeable contingencies about the situation, how it plays in the U.S., how it's, what the circumstances are in Taiwan and China with allies and so on, how they go about it. There's just too many imponderables to know. That said, there are a lot of things Taiwan can do to increase the likelihood that the U.S. would intervene. And that I was kind of obliquely trying to mention this would be the more Taiwan can do to develop the kind of capabilities that would be most useful for making the extremely difficult naval operations that China would be attempting more difficult are exactly what would help the most, and that's in particular road mobile tells and the kind of systems that enable them, deeper munition stocks, integrated sensor networks, and integrated in terms of and possibly other things as well, like mines and so on. But all those things, by making it harder, first of all, it's just straight up adds to deterrence, and second, it increases the likelihood that a U.S. president would be in a position to argue that the U.S. should get engaged. I mean, an example worth thinking about, although I haven't really thought it through as much as I probably should, is the Ukraine case, where initially the U.S. was skeptical about the Ukrainian government's ability to fight against the Russian February 2022 invasion, and as famously offered, as President Zelensky put it, a ride, which he rejected, and I'm sure you all remember in the spring, the Ukrainian militaries and Ukrainian people's reaction in the spring of 2022 enormously helped them get support from European allies and the U.S. enormously. So I think that's a case worth thinking about.
It reminds me about the classic depiction of the U.S. and USSR arms race relations. Do you think that, as we speak, is it still desirable or feasible to bring the arms control regime, as we speak about arms race between the U.S., the current U.S. and PRC? So could you touch upon the bring down mechanism that has been successfully contemplated during the heydays of Cold War era between the USA and USSR? Thank you.
So there's I guess I'd distinguish between two areas of arms racing. Well, one, okay, on the nuclear side, U.S. administrations, or certainly the Biden administration, was very interested and tried repeatedly to talk to Beijing about guardrails, to initiate starting to talk about nuclear arms, and repeatedly, at least by their accounts, got no reply at all, or essentially nothing from Beijing. And that has led to a strong perception that that Xi Jinping and the PLA are simply committed to building up their nuclear arsenal. We don't know exactly how far, but a lot. Probably at least 1,000 ICBMs. Who knows? I think they'll probably go beyond that. That they want something that looks more like parity with the U.S. and the Russians. There's a very interesting debate going on about just what the thinking is behind that. But I guess to your question, I don't think there's really any serious prospects of arms control in the nuclear area between the U.S. And China at the moment. Certainly, it would be a good idea to keep trying to have discussions, or, the U.S. leaders are very influenced by, and their bureaucracy very influenced by their memory of the Cold War. And so they interpret things very much in like, we think back to how close we came in the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Berlin crisis, and we really think we need to have kind of regular contact to keep things from to reduce the likelihood of misinterpretations and to, as they put it, manage escalation, prevent disastrous inadvertent escalation. To date, the Chinese leadership seems to think they don't see it this way. And I'm not sure, like, I'd interpret such conversations more as like it would be a concession. Anyway, but then there's, in terms of arms racing, in terms of what, I am proposing in a certain sense that the US needs to, as it were, arms race in this particular area of missile development. And I think, following the analogy to the Cold War, it's a case where many paradoxes of the nuclear, apparent paradoxes of the world of nuclear weapons and things like them, is that building a conventional triad, secure second strike capability, would reduce the risk of war and reduce the risk of inadvertent escalation more than arms control would. Because if the U.S. didn't do this, we're in this situation of reciprocal incentives for strikes. I don't see really any prospect that the PRC is going to disassemble its counter-intervention capabilities in the missile area. And you can kind of understand why. I mean, yeah, so I guess the short answer is no. I don't really see at the moment much prospect for arms control along the lines of what we saw in the late 60s and 70s between the US and the Soviets. Sorry for going on. It occurs to me, maybe you could imagine the US and China starting to, just as what really gets arms control seriously going between the US and the Soviets is actually China, and the realization that the US and the Soviets have a common interest in non-proliferation. I guess, I mean, I've always wondered about why Beijing is not more concerned about South Korean and even more Japanese nuclear weapons. So, I wonder if things could they evolve in some way where that's an area where you could see some arms control cooperation, where both the U.S. and Beijing decide they see it as in their interest to kind of try to reinforce and cooperate with each other in ways to shore up the NPT? I don't know.
Thank you, Professor Fearon, for this fantastic talk. I have two questions. By the way, I'm running through from Seneca. So the first question is, how does building a survivable system capable of striking into deep in China convince them that it is purely defensive? And really, isn't it possible that Beijing might consider that as like a potential future tool of compelling? So in that sense, we're not doing simply the question of deterrence, but a potential scenario where certain type of compellence might be utilized. So that's the first question. The second question is, if China believes that the U.S. survival forces will soon negate its current missile advantage, as you described, is it possible that this kind of incentive might actually trigger Beijing to strike now, given that it could be like a commitment probably in the future, so that they better just act now before the new Triad proposal is fully operationalized? Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. I think there on the second one, would this course increase incentives for the PRC to use force before these capabilities are sufficiently realized that operations on Taiwan would become too dangerous or risky? Yes, that is a concern. And it raises the issue of timing and how fast things go. But yeah, I think that is potentially a concern. You saw, the emplacement of some of these road mobile missile capabilities in the Philippines was certainly noticed very much so by Beijing, and they were not happy about it at all. So I think that's true. The first thing I'm less concerned about, I mean, the U.S. already has capabilities that pose threats to their PLA rocket force systems. In some ways, what a conventional triad would do would reduce the risk. I don't think it really increases it. It doesn't increase a coercive capability on the U.S. part. It actually is, if you believe the kind of shelling Wolfstetter logic, it's actually calming by lowering the fear that the U.S. will be tempted to move very quickly because their systems are so vulnerable. At least that's, and I think that's a plausible argument. So I don't really see it as increasing coercive leverage for the U.S. any more than developing the nuclear triad increased either the U.S. or the Soviets' ability to coerce the other side by threatening to use those forces. In fact, it reduces that.
Thank you very much. So my name is Yihao Su, from National Taiwan University. So I have questions regarding the utilities and costs of using drone. So in your presentations, you argue that at least emerging technology can only be complementary. They can be the substitutes of conventional weapons and defense system. But there is an alternative argument, right? So some American policymakers contend that in the asymmetric warfare, using drone can also be the credible and costly signal because they can be constantly operating. So in other words, they won't get tired. So that's the reason why some American policymakers encourages more states like Taiwan to develop and invest more resources in buying more drones and UAV to equip their military build up. So I wonder if you would reconsider the utilities of using drone if we move the focus from great power wars between United States and China to the asymmetric warfare between Taiwan and China.
Yeah, this is a good question, and I wish I had Andrew here to answer it because he knows a lot more about these kind of nuts and bolts, bombs and bullets type issues. I think that I was kind of referring to could drone technology substitute in the case of US forces. It may be that the applications for Taiwan's military are much more promising. Also, I want to stress that for this conventional triad, a key part of it is resilient command and control, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, targeting infrastructure, and sensor networks of drones to send back information that facilitate targeting and are redundant to, like, say, your satellites aren't working, could be really important for the US. For Taiwan, I don't know. I mean, I think I don't know enough about whether, how lethal or how damaging these capabilities could be. Some of them probably pretty good. So I think you're right. It could be that the application for the Taiwanese military would be very valuable. I think the sense I have, and again, I wish he was here, and I shouldn't be attributing to him that the PRC's numerical advantages are so great, and ability to produce material are so great that a determined PRC is pretty hard for Taiwan to unilaterally cope with. And that's why US enhanced and survivable missile capability really makes strengthens deterrence a lot more if we could develop it.
Yeah, so I'm Joseph Tawi Wong. I'm an economist at NTU. And I wanted to ask a more theoretical problem about the conventional triad. Because the nuclear triad relies on its power of mass destruction to generate this balance of fear. because you have to respond to a nuclear attack with a nuclear attack. And so there's this point of no return. But, and it's this downward spiral that prevents people from starting everything. But does a conventional triad still have a similar power of mass destruction to generate the same deterrence? Because you can deploy these weapons bit by bit and do some salami slicing.
Yes, it's a very big difference is that there's nothing here in the operational concept for the conventional triad that is about attacking the other side's populations or attacking military sites that, because nuclear weapons are so unbelievably destructive and have radiation, would inevitably kill a lot of civilians. Instead, this is a counterforce problem where we want assured second strike because to reduce the temptation, given the PRC's goal of counter-intervention, that the fear is that it could be too tempting to move quickly to try to eliminate the capabilities that would make seizing Taiwan possible. And those capabilities are US and ally and partner missile capabilities to target their intervention forces. So there is that difference. But maybe, is that addressing your question?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Professor Fearon, for your great talk. I'm Deepa Chen from National Chengchi University. So my first question is about the usefulness of the so-called open source intelligence. And we know that there has been a rise for open source intelligence for over decades. And some would argue that it reveals information, making states more difficult to hide capability. So it is helping deterrence. Some other would argue that it makes the leaders of these decision makers more likely to question the survivability of their nuclear weapons, and they will increase their efforts to hide their capability. So I wonder how you view this in the age of nuclear weapons nowadays, especially in West Pacifics regarding China. My second question is more about ion theory question. As you mentioned, that you don't think regional hegemony is a useful concept, but I would agree with that. But my further question is, does the sphere of influence still matter for states? Because right now, in every conflict we have seen in recent years, states are fighting for a sphere of influence. As a matter of fact, we can also argue that the United States care about Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea because it's U.S. sphere of influence. So would that be the primary cause for war in the future? Thank you.
Great. Open source intelligence, I don't know very much about that. I wouldn't think that would be a big concern for revealing nuclear capabilities. I mean, we have all these wonderful satellite photographs of the silos that China's building in their hinterland, but they knew that was going to be, that's not, it's not open source intelligence that matters for that. I mean, they knew that these things were going to be very detectable anyway. I mean, it is something of a puzzle as to why, or an interesting question as to why they decided to do their nuclear modernization and build up with land-based silos. But otherwise, no, I don't know about the, I mean, you mentioned whether open source intelligence helps by revealing capabilities. I don't know, thinking again about the Ukraine war, what was quite interesting there was it made it difficult for, it it made it somewhat difficult for I think the Russians to control the narrative as much as they wanted to, and that might be an interesting effect. That it puts some constraints on ability to kind of control the narrative of what's happening in a conflict. Your question about spheres of influence. Absolutely, Putin wants to restore, I mean, arguably not just a sphere of influence, but something approximating the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, and the former Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. Maybe he'll succeed in taking Kiev someday, but it's actually, I view that as an example of how stunningly difficult it is. In that case, not even, obviously Ukraine doesn't even have nuclear weapons. It's 1/4 as large as Russia, and 2.5 years later, where Russia's taken very, very little territory at absolutely enormous cost. So I don't know. Maybe I'm skeptical that he's going to be able to restore something like a Soviet Union, but we'll see. U.S. sphere of influence. I mean, maybe this is, I don't know, the U.S. angle on that would be that the U.S. has a vital interest in maintaining in trade with large economies of the Pacific Rim, and for that purpose has a strong interest in the political independence or the economic independence and the political autonomy of countries in the region. I don't think, these terms like sphere of influence and hegemony come with a certain connotation of control, and I often want to know exactly what are the benefits there, or I don't know. The U.S. has a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, which allows them to do all kinds of things, but it doesn't allow the U.S. to control the internal politics very well of countries in the Western Hemisphere at all. And I would think similarly for China in Asia. I think I'd have similar, I need to think about it more, but I think I'd have similar concerns about sphere of influence. It's kind of another way, a somewhat softer way of saying hegemony, I guess.
Thanks, Jim. I really enjoyed this. I guess one area, I don't know whether this is sort of pushing back or disagreeing with you at all, is that, a credible second strike in the conventional space seems to give you a much broader set of options. So conventional second strike in the nuclear space is constrained by the sort of technology of nuclear weapons. And I guess I'm a little bit more persuaded that something like a distributed sub-based drone second strike capability would be reasonable, right? That if you indeed had a similar sort of, whether it's the Virginia class or another, a set of, similar to the recent attack that the Ukrainians did, quite long range, right, against Russian air forces. That kind of, to me, seems like a sort of fusing of this third offset with the kind of conventional second strike you're talking about. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that a conventional second strike in this case would very easily incorporate in a lot of other new technology rather than simply kind of boosting existing precision sort of missile capabilities. And it would still achieve the goal that you're trying to get.
Well, you mean in terms of what? In terms of like the sensor systems and the C4ISRT?
No, I'm thinking about drones actually as, loitering munitions or something like that, where indeed these newer technologies would be part of the conventional second strike itself, rather than just getting hypersonics or more of them or something.
Well, the question is, for allies and partners, for the U.S., where are these capabilities? They have to be on U.S. bases in ally and partner territory. It's too far away.
Maybe, but I guess what I'm saying is, is the right investment for the U.S. to say we should get a hell of a lot more, Navy based, Tomahawks or whatever, versus coming up with a new loitering munition based UAV system based from submarines that then would, expand the set of punches where you can hit the second strike from, right? So I think that's where I'm taking issues that I agree with you, sure, we can have a lot more intermediate precision strike missiles, but there are other things we could be investing in that achieve the same goal, but actually maybe take advantage of some of these advances.
Well, I wish Andrew was here for this, but I think there's this issue of energy, right? How do you get the loitering munition from Alaska to Taiwan or Japan? You're saying, well, what if you could put them on submarines? Interesting idea. I don't know. I'm sure there are possibilities there. Is the trade-off with missiles on the submarine, advantageous? This is a force planning problem. So I wouldn't rule it out, and maybe there's complementary things to do there. But with palletized munitions, the bombers can take off from the western hemisphere and or very far away. Submarines, nuclear-powered ones, can run around for really long periods of time, really long distances. Yeah.
So I guess maybe this is slightly semantic, so forgive me.
Right.
Is that even the palletized thing to me seems like a new innovation, more so it is an advance rather than a sort of taking our existing capabilities and making them sort of stronger, right? To me, it's more akin to the third offset discussion.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi, Professor. I'm Jiajin from National University School. So I have two related questions. First is about conceptual ones. So I would like to know what's the ultimate goal of your proposed conventional deterrence trial? Is it to prevent China's PRC's attack through deterrence, or is it actually to deny a PRC's much more massive military action after they move first? So that's the first question. And second, so I believe that when we are thinking about nuclear deterrence trial, it's very important the effective successful deterrence is the ability to hide your second strike capability. So that's why the trial comes in. Plus, effective communication of resolve and intentions. So now it's a more practical situation. The current communication between US and China seems not so robust, to say the least. So given these situations, now if you increase these conventional deterrence trial capabilities, will that actually increase the risk of armed conflict, as others might suggest? And especially your proposed solution actually include the extended deterrence with allies. So now I think it raises a huge cause or huge challenge of command and control. So does communication right now actually include PRCs and the US with allies if we follow your conventional deterrence trial? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure can you say again what the thing about communication was that you wanted me to address?
Okay, so if you increase your deterrence, conventional deterrence trial, you want to convince your opponents that you want to maintain status quo, not to attack. So that really rely on the robust communication channels. And now your proposed solutions means that US need to strengthen its conventional trial with its allies support. So allies may also need to increase their conventional deterrence capabilities. And so now it raises two questions about communications. First, how is reliable? How do PRC believe U.S. intention and resolve is to maintain status quo? And second, how does PRC believe the U.S. ally, which is South Korea, Taiwan's later increase of conventional deterrence actually is trying to maintain status quo?
Yes. So the first thing you asked about was, is this about deterrence or denial?
Yes.
So both, right? I mean, here is a case where you try to strengthen deterrence by improving the prospects of denial. Straightforward as that. Like the harder, the higher the likelihood that denial succeeds, the idea is the stronger deterrence would be. I'm not sure, like on the communication thing, I mean, I think the idea, which is maybe too simple, is that if you, adopt say this approach or whatever it is that the U.S. and allies and partners are trying to do with their military capabilities and force posture, that China will notice that. They spend a lot of time analyzing it and doing their own analysis. If they say, oh, this makes the problem harder, because we have to deal with this, and this, then that's contributing to deterrence. And that, in principle, can happen without any communication at all, simply by them observing how you're, oh, you got these road mobile missiles in the Philippines now. Oh, well, you have to take care of that, and et cetera, et cetera. So, but I guess you're raising a question of like, what in IR theory we think about more as, or is often discussed under the heading of like, are your efforts taken to deter going to be interpreted as aggressive and likely to lead Chinese leadership to think like, well, this buildup is preliminary to them attacking us or something like that. I think in this case, the main concern there is or as I understand it, I think the main concern is this concern that they fear, Beijing fears that the U.S. will either deliberately or unintentionally lead Taiwanese leadership to do things that they find unacceptable. And that they are very worried about, I mean, I do think that the Xi Jinping and Chinese leadership view themselves as defensive actors who are being pushed by Taiwan and the US, rather than sort of purely offensive actors. I think that's true. That said, I don't see how, how would you minimize the risk of war here? Well, if the US said, we concede, we're telling you right now, we are not fighting for Taiwan. We don't want you to do it, but we're out, right? You could do that, that would minimize the risk or that would lower the risk of a big war. But it would also be giving up on, it would be giving up, it would be making a concession that they don't want to make, and I think for some good reasons.
Ellie Berman, UC San Diego, one of the homes of the Pacific Fleet, of these now redundant aircraft carriers. So Jim, this is also a question about the relationship between the conventional and the nuclear deterrence. So, assuming that once a missile is in the air, you can't tell and you can't signal what the warhead is. There's always this possibility that a conventional war leads into a nuclear war because the first strike, the incentives to first strike become stronger once you can mask the first strike in the context of a conventional war.
In principle, yes. In practice, it's not a concern that I've seen a lot of discussion about. The US, Russia, I assume the PRC, spend a lot of time trying to track where are the nuclear weapons, and it's not as simple of like, it's not like the US could like load a nuclear warhead onto any of these missiles. So I think distinguishability is pretty good.
And so you can think of the conventional deterrence and the nuclear deterrence as kind of separate problems?
No, not entirely. What they mainly talk about in this area is entanglement meaning that the places you attacked we don't know exactly how much it implicates their nuclear capabilities, and vice versa for them, for us.
So let me push back a little harder. So that I think, when you looked at the missile and counter-missile capabilities that the West demonstrated in the confrontation with Iran a year ago in the spring, and you saw in real dominance of the Western technologies over the Russian technologies that the Iranians had. And yet, that dominance didn't translate into the NATO allies being more aggressive in Ukraine. And the reason for that, I thought, was that the Russians had a nuclear deterrent. Is that an unfair reading, or is that an incorrect reading?
I had a feeling you were going to raise this issue, and I should have studied up more. I don't know. It's certainly true that the U.S., the Biden administration was very concerned about nuclear risk in the Ukraine conflict, and I think they had reason to be concerned. I don't know enough about the Iran case, but what would the implication be anyway?
I think I'm looking for this link between the conventional and the nuclear, and trying to understand whether you can, the degree of entanglement.
In the Western Pacific case, China has nuclear weapons and the U.S. has nuclear weapons. So I think that that the onset of a conflict are going to see both sides worrying a lot about nuclear escalation, a lot. Yeah, I think it's dramatically actually underestimated by U.S. military planning how much that's going to be a concern for U.S. leadership.
Okay, I think we have heard a great talk and also very lively Q&A. We all learned a lot, and I appreciate this opportunity very much myself personally, because this is the first time since I left the campus of UC Berkeley 34 years ago, and that was my last time that I met Jim. So thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.